He was running routine patrol on a quiet Sunday morning when the radio crackled to life with a call that froze him in his tracks. A stray dog was spotted limping along the edge of the highway, its coat a patchwork of dirt and scars. But as he approached the overpass, heart pounding, he recognized the familiar shape, the angle of the ears, the way it held its head. This dog looked exactly like Daisy, the golden retriever he'd lost nearly a year ago. In that split second, years of heartbreak and hope collided, sending a thrill of urgency through his veins. He eased his cruiser onto the shoulder and climbed out, badge glinting in the rising sun. The dog stood 6 feet away, back to him, tail wagging hesitantly at the roar of passing semis. Memories surfaced. The day Daisy slipped out of the gate, chasing a squirrel into the woods, the frantic posters he'd plastered on every telephone pole, the empty bed in his living room that still bore her scent. He steadied his voice, coaxing her with soft whistles, careful to mask the tremor he felt inside. She turned, and he froze. The patchwork fur, the crooked left ear, the lazy loll of her tongue, every detail matched. But stray dogs often resemble each other, and he reminded himself not to get his hopes up. As he crouched low, extending a gentle hand, her tail wagged faster, hope flickering in her amber eyes. He spoke her name, barely above a whisper. Daisy. His own voice sounded foreign, weighted with longing. She bounded forward, stumbling on the uneven asphalt, and he scooped her up, checking her limp. The leg was swollen, but the pain in his chest was far worse, the possibility that this might just be a look-alike. He glanced at her collar. A tarnished tag dangled, engraving nearly worn away. With trembling fingers, he flipped it over, a phone number and the name Buddy. His heart sank. Buddy was another missing dog whose owner had posted flyers in this precinct. Yet the resemblance was uncanny. He loaded her into the back of the cruiser, windows cracked for fresh air, and dialed the number. His radio remained silent, the highway noise fading away as he leaned forward, ears straining for any clue in her soft whimpers. The dispatcher told him the owner was at work but would return to pick up Buddy in an hour. An hour. Every second stretched like a mile as he drove toward the animal shelter. Part of him prayed the tag had been switched, that this was Daisy in disguise, waiting for him to solve the puzzle. The shelter's metal gates clanged behind him. As he carried her through the intake door, the staff fell silent, recognizing the officer who'd saved dozens of strays. He set her down gently on the cold concrete floor, kneeling to meet her gaze. I need to know who you really are, he murmured. They brought a scanner for the microchip. He exhaled slowly, watching as the technician swiped the device over her shoulder blades. Each beep echoed in his ears. When the screen flickered to life, a code appeared. He held his breath as they ran the database. Then the name came up, Daisy Summers. His knees nearly buckled. The room spun for a heartbeat. This was no coincidence. Daisy Summers, his Daisy, registered under his own name, complete with address and vaccination history. Tears welled in his eyes as he absorbed every letter on that screen. After all this time, she had been found, and she was alive. He scooped her into his arms, burying his face in her fur. She licked his cheek, tail thumping against his chest as if exulting in the reunion. In that moment, every lonely night he had spent staring at her empty bowl, every frantic search party through the woods, flashed behind his eyelids. The pain of loss gave way to overwhelming relief. And yet, questions swirled like dust in the sunbeams streaming through the windows. How did she cross continents? How had she ended up on that highway? And most haunting, why had the people who found her let her wander, tag dangling unread? For weeks? He cradled her as they called animal control to close out the intake. As they prepared paperwork, he noticed a note scrawled on the back of the microchip form. Found flagged for aggression, it read. His heart sank again. Aggression? Daisy had always been the gentlest soul, content to fetch a ball and nap in the sun. They explained that the stray had bitten a volunteer who tried to approach too quickly. The bite was minor, but protocol dictated quarantine and evaluation. He stared at the note, mind racing. Could his Daisy have snapped under stress? The thought was unbearable. Yet, another possibility, someone else's finger had triggered a fearful reaction in a dog terrified and hungry on the streets. He asked to see the volunteer, to hear their account. She described a scruffy dog cornered near a chain-link fence, eyes wild with panic. The volunteer had tried to calm her, reached for the collar, and the dog had leapt forward, teeth flashing. That matched Buddy's file, not Daisy's gentle temperament. The verdict seemed to confirm that this dog, though Daisy by chip, had gone through rough times that changed her behavior. He knew what he had to do. He volunteered to keep her at home under his care until she was cleared. The shelter director hesitated, protocols were strict, but then saw the recognition in Daisy's eyes as she wagged her tail at him across the lobby. They relented. He signed forms relieving the shelter of liability and promised daily check-ins. He drove home under a sky streaked with afternoon clouds. As he climbed the porch steps, Daisy sniffed every corner, ears alert, tail wagging slowly. Inside, the door closed behind them, and he freed her from the leash. She bounded into the living room, paws skidding on the hardwood floor, and came to rest at the spot where her bed lay. He knelt and smoothed the blanket, and she curled up, head on her paws, eyes half closed in contentment. A single tear escaped down his cheek. That night, he lay on the couch beside her, listening to her gentle snores. Sleep was elusive, memories of her disappearance mixed with the joy of her return. He wondered how she'd survived, the bite scars on her shoulder, the thin ribs beneath her fur. She had scraped by, scavenging crumbs, dodging cars, a stray no longer recognized by anyone, until fate brought her to his patrol car. Morning came with a soft golden light. He prepared her breakfast, her favorite kibble soaked in chicken broth, and watched as she devoured it hungrily. He sat across the table, coffee in hand, heart full but wary. He needed answers. He called the precinct historian, a detective who tracked missing pets and cold case leads. They arranged to review local reports of break-ins, animal cruelty complaints, any sign of a dog matching Daisy's description. As he waited for the detective, he observed Daisy exploring the backyard through the kitchen window. She sniffed at the rose bushes, tail wagging with cautious optimism. He remembered her chasing butterflies in this very yard, her joy infectious in spring sunlight. Now she approached every new scent like a wary traveler lost in foreign lands. He vowed to restore her trust. The detective arrived mid-morning, papers in hand. They pored over maps of the area, marking points where Daisy might have eluded capture after her disappearance last summer. There was an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town where stray dogs often congregated, and a makeshift dumping ground for unwanted litters. But nothing concrete. The detective suggested reaching out to a network of volunteers who tracked lost pets via social media alerts and GPS tagging devices. Together they drafted a plan to retrace her steps, hoping to uncover who had taken her in, or perhaps stolen and discarded her. He spent the afternoon with Daisy at a local park, leash in hand, but letting her set the pace. She sniffed every tree as if calling out to ghosts of her past life. Children waved and pointed, recognizing the uniformed officer walking the golden retriever. He found himself answering the same question over and over. Is she really yours? And he would smile, nod, and explain. Each time, the world seemed a little smaller, and the story a little more unbelievable. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of purple and gold, he guided Daisy back to the cruiser. He buckled her in gently, and she settled on the back seat, head resting against the door. He closed his eyes for a moment, reflecting on the twist of fate that reunited them. But even as relief washed over him, an undercurrent of unease persisted. The tag reading, Buddy, the aggression report, the mystery of her journey, none of it made sense. He knew this was just the beginning of a story that ran deeper than a simple reunion. That night, after Daisy slept soundly on her bed, he pored over case files in his study, surrounded by photographs of her as a puppy, his notes from volunteers, stray dog reports. Each scrap of information was a clue, each question a thread to pull. He marked dates and locations on a map pinned to the wall, connecting dots like constellations. Somewhere in those lines lay the truth of her disappearance and the identity of those responsible. And then he saw it, a single entry in a volunteer's log, dated just 2 weeks after Daisy vanished, reporting a dog matching her description seen near an old shipping container yard down by the river. The container yard was slated for demolition 2 months later, access restricted, and records showed no formal petition to search it. He rose, heart hammering, grabbed his coat, and leaned down to whisper in Daisy's ear, "Tomorrow, we go there." She opened one eye and gave a sleepy wag, unaware that their journey had just taken a turn into danger. He flicked off the light and closed his eyes, already drifting into dreams filled with memories of golden afternoons and boundless fields, before awakening to the promise of answers at first light. The road ahead would test them both, but he was ready. After all, some bonds are stronger than loss itself. Dawn arrived in a soft haze, the kind that muffles sound and distorts shapes until you're unsure what's real. He strapped Daisy's leash to his belt and slipped into his patrol uniform, heart pounding with a mix of excitement and dread. The cruiser's headlights cut through the early mist as he navigated the back roads toward the riverfront district. Every pothole felt like an omen, every flicker of movement at the roadside a reminder that danger could be lurking anywhere. They arrived at the shipping container yard just as the gates swung open for a demolition crew. Rusted metal towers loomed overhead, stacked like monoliths in disrepair. The air smelled of oil and decay. He clicked his flashlight on and patted Daisy's flank. She stiffened, nose twitching as she picked up 1,000 scents: rats, oil, distant food, and something else: fear. He checked his radio. No signal this close to the fences. He slipped his handset into his pocket and drew in a steadying breath. "Stay close," he murmured, more to himself than to her. Together, they slipped past the first rows of containers, their footsteps swallowed by silence. The ground was littered with broken glass and scrap metal that crunched under Daisy's paws, but she pressed on, driven by memory and instinct. They reached the foot of a container marked Horizon Shipping in faded red letters. A cracked padlock hung loose, as if someone had forced entry long ago. He shone his light inside. Empty crates lay scattered across the floor, and in one corner, a pile of matted blankets. His throat tightened. This could have been Daisy's hideout. He lifted a blanket gently, no movement. His heart sank. He brushed his finger along the floor. Tiny tracks of dried blood led deeper into the yard. He followed them to a narrow alley between containers. The air grew colder, the fog denser. Daisy paused, ears perked, and let out a low whine. He knelt beside her, brushing a strand of fur from her muzzle. "We're not alone," he whispered, scanning the shadows. A distant clang echoed, a container door slamming shut somewhere beyond. He signaled Daisy to heel and clicked on his secondary flashlight, its beam narrower but sharper. As they advanced, he remembered the volunteer's log entry, a glimpse of golden fur, a terrified dog backed into a corner. He tightened his grip on the leash. Ahead, he saw a figure silhouetted, hunched over. He raised his voice. "Hey, police." The figure froze, then bolted between the containers. He dashed after, Daisy at his side, her limp momentarily forgotten. They rounded a corner into a claustrophobic gap barely wide enough for Daisy's shoulders. The figure turned, face hidden beneath a hood. In one hand they clutched a syringe, in the other, a leather strap. The officer's mind raced. Drugs? Illegal animal experiments? The possibilities twisted into nightmares. He called out, authoritative but calm. "Stop. Drop the syringe." The figure hesitated, then lunged forward. Daisy barked, low and urgent, and the man recoiled, stumbling backward. He tripped over a metal beam and fell, the syringe skittering across the gravel. The hooded man scrambled for it, but the officer kicked it to a halt, raising his baton. "Hands where I can see them." The intruder froze, panting. Then, abruptly, he threw off the hood, revealing a gaunt face with haunted eyes. The officer blinked. He looked familiar. A volunteer from the shelter, the one who'd reported the bite. Fear and relief warred in his chest. He kept his stance firm. "Why are you here? What are you doing with that syringe?" The man's hand shook as he rose, sliding the strap from his belt to the ground. I thought I could help her," he stammered, voice trembling. "They said she was aggressive. I wanted to calm her down with a sedative so she wouldn't hurt anyone." He locked eyes with Daisy, who sat watching, tail wagging tentatively. "I saw her wandering here weeks ago, and I couldn't forget her eyes. I thought if I could just get her to a vet, maybe they could fix her leg, get her back to you." The officer's grip on the baton loosened. "You could have called me. You could have called the shelter." The man swallowed hard. "I was scared. They'd shut me out if I told them I found her before the chip scan. I thought I was doing the right thing." He nodded toward Daisy. "I put out food and blankets, tried to earn her trust, but she was too afraid. I had to get her before someone else hurt her." Daisy stood and nosed the man's hand. He froze, then let his fingers brush her fur. Relief washed over her face. Tears welled in the officer's eyes. "She's yours?" he asked softly. The man nodded, shoulders sagging. She let me touch her once." Then men in uniforms showed up. I ran. He glanced at the discarded syringe. I panicked. The officer holstered his baton and knelt, patting Daisy's head. "You did what you thought was best," he said. "But you have to follow protocol." He called dispatch on his radio, voice steady despite the storm in his chest. Backup would arrive, evidence collected, charges decided. Yet as he rose, he realized something deeper. This man's fear mirrored Daisy's. Both had been abandoned, petrified of authority. And here they stood, reunited by fate as much as by this officer's determination. He unlocked the gate and guided them out, side by side. The man walked ahead, head bowed, Daisy trotting between them. Light filtered through the mist, turning metal into gold. Tomorrow, he'd press charges. But today, he felt only gratitude. For the volunteers' flawed bravery, for the second chance granted to Daisy, for the bond that had brought them all together. He exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing. Yet as they cleared the yard, Daisy paused, ears alert. Across the fence, a lone figure watched from the tree lean, face obscured by shadows. The officer tensed. He reached for his radio, but it crackled static. The figure slipped away, swallowed by the trees. A chill ran down his spine. Someone else had been here, someone who didn't want Daisy or the volunteer to find her. He tightened his grip on Daisy's leash. The reunion was real, the volunteer's remorse genuine, but this yard had been used for darker purposes too. He glanced at the volunteer, whose face was turned toward the fading mist. "You said you wanted to help her," he murmured. The man nodded, eyes haunted. "But someone else brought her here before me. Someone who left her broken and alone." The officer looked toward the woods, mind racing. He patted Daisy's head. "Then it's not over," he said. "We'll find out who did this to her and to you." Daisy leaned into his leg, as if understanding. The sun broke through the clouds, illuminating the yard behind them, but darkness lingered at the edges of the trees. He led Daisy and the volunteer back to the cruiser, heart pounding. They would sort out the legalities tomorrow. Tonight, he would keep her safe. But the watcher in the woods remained a question unsolved. And in that unanswered moment, he knew this story had only just begun. They piled into the cruiser, the volunteer in the front seat, Daisy panting softly between them. The engine hummed as they rolled away from the container yard, leaving rusted steel monoliths behind. The sun had broken through the mist, but the memory of that shadowy watcher lingered in the officer's mind. He stole glances at the volunteer in the rearview mirror, pale, shaken, hands clenching the fabric of his jeans. "Are you all right?" the officer asked quietly. The volunteer swallowed and nodded, though his eyes told another story. "I'm sorry," he whispered, "for everything." Daisy leaned against the volunteer's shoulder, offering comfort in a wag and a nuzzle. The officer glanced at the dog. She seemed calmer, as if sensing safety in their trio. They drove in silence until the precinct came into view, crisp blue and white letters on the brick building. Inside, the detective who'd helped with Daisy's case was waiting. He rose as they entered, folding the volunteer's log and the syringe into an evidence bag. "We'll process charges in the morning," the detective said, voice steady. "For now, you should get some rest." The volunteer nodded, relief and fear mingling in his expression. The officer slipped outside with Daisy, leash in hand. She hesitated at the threshold of the lobby, nostrils flaring as if smelling something beyond the glass doors. He crouched beside her, gently stroking her head. "You did good," he murmured. But her ears flicked toward the parking lot, and she let out a low whine. He followed her gaze, an unmarked van idling under a street lamp, tinted windows framing darkness. The driver's door opened for a heartbeat, then slammed shut. The van peeled away before the officer could reach the door. His gut clenched. The watcher in the trees, now this van, someone was tracking Daisy. Someone who didn't want her found. He clicked his radio. "Dispatch, run plates on a white Ford cargo van. Unknown plate, just left precinct lot, heading westbound." No answer. He tried again. Static. He glanced at Daisy. Her head drooped, eyes heavy with exhaustion and confusion. He scooped her into his arms, scent of street and fear clinging to her coat. "Let's go home," he said, voice firm. Back at his house, he set Daisy gently on her bed. She circled once, then sank down, eyes never leaving him. He flicked on the kettle and sat at the kitchen table, the volunteer's file open before him. Maps, timelines, witness statements, pieces of a puzzle he was determined to solve. His phone buzzed, a text from the volunteer's wife. "Is he okay? Please tell me he's safe." He typed back, "He's safe. We'll talk tomorrow." The kettle clicked off. He poured water into a mug, then paused. Fear and responsibility warred within him. Daisy had been through hell. She deserved peace. But whoever had taken her from his life and from her home was still out there. He wrapped his hands around the mug and closed his eyes, images flashing. Daisy trapped behind a fence, the volunteer cornered by desperation, the van in the dark. Morning came too early. He trudged downstairs to find Daisy waiting by the door, tail thumping. He grabbed her leash and keys, and they drove to the riverfront once more. The volunteer was waiting at the edge of the parking lot, who'd drawn low. Relief and shame warred in his eyes when he saw them. They walked back into the yard together. The officer swept the ground, flashlight beam dancing across footprints and broken glass. Daisy led him to the same gap between containers where the volunteer had nearly seized her with the syringe. The guardrails outside bore fresh scuff marks, as if something heavy had been dragged through. They followed the trail to a muddy embankment sloping toward the river. At the bottom, half buried in mud, lay the torn remains of Daisy's old leash, bright blue, frayed at the end. The officer's heart thudded. "This is where she was cornered," he said, voice low. The volunteer nodded, eyes fixed on the mud. "I found her here," he whispered. "She wouldn't move toward me. I tried to follow the trail upriver, but then the van showed up. They crept along the bank, footprints littered with evidence of a struggle, drop of blood on a rock, paw prints splattered in mud. The river's current hissed against the shore like a predator circling. He unclipped Daisy's leash and let her nose the ground. She bounded ahead, urgent and focused, then stopped at a rusted hatch embedded in the bank. Metal teeth had been forced apart. He pried it open and peered into darkness, a tunnel, narrow and slick with moisture. He shone his light inside. The beam caught hints of graffiti, symbols he'd seen in reports of an illegal animal fighting ring that operated near the docks. The volunteer swallowed audibly. They used that tunnel, he said, to move dogs without being seen. The officer's jaw clenched. Someone had trafficked Daisy here, hidden her in the catacombs beneath the city. The same someone had hunted other dogs broken and sold for profit. He closed the hatch and stood. "We're going in," he said, voice steady. Daisy pressed against his leg, ready. The volunteer hesitated, then nodded. Together, they edged toward the entrance, flashlight beams cutting through the gloom. Behind them, the river roared, carrying ripples of their footsteps. They climbed down wooden planks slick with algae. The air grew cold, and the tunnel walls dripped water onto the uneven floor. Ahead, a low hum of voices, muffled but menacing. The officer's pulse raced. He signaled the volunteer to stay low. Daisy padded silently at his side, ears alert. They rounded a bend into a concrete chamber lit by a single bare bulb swinging overhead. The officer counted 3 silhouettes leaning over cages. His light landed on the nearest cage, and his breath caught. Inside, a trembling dog with golden fur, eyes wide with fear. It was not Daisy, but another retriever, younger, ribs showing, collar gone. The cage door was padlocked, and beside it lay a syringe stained with rust. The men turned at the intruders, startled. One reached for a rifle slung across his back. Another drew a butcher knife. The officer stepped forward, baton ready, voice booming. "Police. Drop your weapons." Daisy let out a fierce bark, jaws snapping. The men froze, indecision flickering in their eyes. The officer took another step. Nobody moved. He could feel their fear, their greed. But he also sensed a crack in their confidence, a chance to end this ring and free dozens of dogs. His radio crackled with life for the first time in hours. Backup was on the way. He glanced at Daisy, whose stance was protective, unwavering. He nodded. In that silent exchange, they agreed. This was their fight. The officer raised his baton, and Daisy lunged at the nearest attacker, teeth bared. The men hesitated, then dropped their weapons, hands raised. As the guard doors clanged open behind them and uniformed officers flooded the chamber, the officer exhaled. The rescue was real, the ring exposed. Yet as he reached down to soothe the frightened retriever, he knew the path to justice, and to healing for every dog trapped here, was only beginning. The tunnel echoed with the sound of footsteps, yanks of chains, and soft whimpers. And in the distance, beyond the darkness, a new dawn waited. The rescue team swarmed the chamber, floodlights snapping on against the dripping concrete walls. The officer stayed low, keeping Daisy between himself and the stunned traffickers as more K-9 units and medics filed in behind him. Soft whimpers rippled through the room as cages were unlocked and battered dogs stumbled out, shaking years of fear from their bones. He knelt beside the golden retriever in the nearest cage, her eyes wild but trusting as he reached in to gently lift her out. She melted against his chest, trembling, but alive. Daisy pressed against his leg, tail wagging uncertainly, as if checking that her human was safe. He wrapped his arm around her, feeling the warmth of her fur against the chill in the tunnel. The medic rushed forward with a stretcher for the injured dogs, and he helped carry the shivering retriever toward the fresh air. Each animal they freed seemed to whisper a story of hardship and hope, and he fought back the lump in his throat. Above, the van's engine coughed to a stop outside. He heard the cargo doors creak as more officers discovered crates filled with syringes, branding irons, and ledger books cataloging sales. Evidence of the ring's hierarchy spilled into plastic bags. Names, addresses, prices per bite, shipping manifests. His jaw clenched as he imagined the cruelty these animals endured for profit. Daisy tugged at her leash, restless, wanting out of the gloom. He led her up the wooden ladder and into the riverfront night, where the air was sharp with the scent of damp leaves and gasoline. She bounded ahead, nose to the ground, tracing paw prints in mud, but this time each step promised freedom. He watched her silhouette against the moonlit skyline, the soft rise and fall of her tail. She was home. The traffickers were handcuffed and hauled away, curses echoing off the walls as detectives read them their rights. He handed off the rescued dogs to animal control, who buzzed with plans to rehabilitate and rehome them. A volunteer offered him a blanket for Daisy, and he draped it over her shoulders as they walked to the cruiser. She leaned into him, eyes bright, as though thanking him for not giving up. He climbed into the driver's seat, Daisy in the passenger's side, and exhaled. The tunnel entrance disappeared behind him, sealed by heavy steel. He patted her head. "We did it," he whispered, voice raw with emotion. She licked his hand, and he felt the steady thump of her heart under his palm. At the precinct, the evidence room glowed under fluorescent lights. The officer and the detective poured through the traffickers' ledgers, tracing wire transfers and nicknames to a shadow network of buyers across state lines. One name resurfaced again and again: Blackwater Industries, an anonymous front company listed as shipping agent. They cross-referenced permits and found no record of dogs ever passing through that company's docks. Someone had fabricated documents, hiding the true scale of the operation. He closed the file and ran a hand through his hair. The ring was bigger than they'd imagined, maybe national, maybe international. And if Daisy's case brought them here, countless other animals remained lost. He glanced at Daisy's blanketing draped over the corner of the table, and a fierce resolve ignited in his chest. He owed her more than rescue. He owed every dog justice. Back home, the moon had given way to a velvet sky spangled with stars. He set Daisy's bowl down in the kitchen. She devoured her dinner with unbridled hunger, then bolted to her bed. He sat at his desk, photographs of each freed dog laid out like cards in a mosaic. Next to them, his notebook bristled with codes and leads: the front company's registration number, the lab where syringes were made, the social media handles of suspected recruiters. Deep into the night, he weaved through news articles and scanned public records, mapping connections by hand. A name kept emerging: Victor Marceau, a small-time breeder who vanished last year, but whose company had ties to Blackwater Industries. He leaned back, mind racing. If Marceau was alive and pulling strings, finding him could unravel the entire network and give every rescued dog a voice in court. He looked at Daisy's silhouette on the couch, chest rising in sleep. Tomorrow, he would visit the lab where the syringes were manufactured, hoping to trace their origin. The volunteer would meet him at sunrise to give a full statement about what he'd witnessed. And the detective had secured a warrant to search Marceau's last known address, an abandoned farm on the outskirts of town. He switched off the desk lamp and rose. Daisy's ears pricked as he approached, and she lifted her head, tail sweeping the floor. He crouched and pressed his forehead to hers. "Rest now," he murmured. "Because tomorrow, we go to war." She blinked sleepily and nudged his hand, as if pledging her loyalty. He stood and glanced out the window at the faint glow of dawn on the horizon. Justice wouldn't wait, and neither would danger. Marceau wouldn't sit idle if he felt the heat. The path forward was murky, fraught with threats from an unseen enemy. But with Daisy by his side, he felt a spark of certainty. They would chase this ring into its darkest corners, no matter how deep the shadows. And in that quiet moment before the storm, he whispered into the fading night, "Tomorrow, we end this." The wind carried his promise away, rustling the leaves in the yard, as if the world itself leaned in to listen. They slipped through the shadows of the abandoned farm before sunrise, Daisy's paws silent on the dew-slick grass. The volunteer carried a battered clipboard. The detective flanked them, sidearm holstered but ready. The night air was thick with anticipation, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl. The officer raised a gloved hand and signaled a halt. A battered barn loomed ahead, its loft window cracked like a watchful eye. They approached the barn door, heavy with splintering under the detective's pry bar. Inside, the stale scent of hay mingled with something far darker: fear and blood. Moonlight filtered through gaps in the boards, illuminating cages stacked against the far wall. At the center, Victor Marceau stood, arms folded, his gaunt face lit by the glow of a single lantern. Rows of anxious dogs trembled in wire cells around him. The officer stepped forward, voice steady and commanding. "Victor Marceau, you're under arrest for animal trafficking, cruelty, and myriad federal offenses. Put your hands where we can see them." Marceau's lips twisted into a sardonic smile. He dropped the lantern, its light guttering as he drew a long hunting knife. "You think you can stop me? I'm the only one who sees their worth." Daisy growled low in her throat for bristling. The detective ducked behind a stack of crates and drew a taser. The volunteer shielded his clipboard like a lifeline of evidence. Marceau lunged, blade flashing. The officer sidestepped, baton raised, deflecting the strike with a ring of sparks. The knife clattered to the floor. "Daisy, now," the officer barked. She darted forward and pinned Marceau's arm to his side with a single, disciplined motion. No teeth, just steel pressure forcing him to the ground. The detective moved in and cuffed Marceau's wrist behind his back. He lay panting, eyes wide with fury and fear. They freed the dogs, guiding them into waiting crates outside as animal control backed up trailers. Each dog emerged blinking into the dawn, stumbling into clean blankets and bowls of water. The officer knelt beside Daisy, stroking her neck as tail thumps echoed softly. Above, the sun rose, burning through the last wisps of night. Light spilled across the yard, illuminating the rescue operation as if spotlighting a victory. Marceau was led away, shouting threats that dissolved into the morning air. The officer watched him go, a flicker of pity crossing his face. The dogs would need weeks, months of rehabilitation, but today they had hope. Today Marceau's ring lay in ruins, his ledger of cruelty now evidence for a lifetime behind bars. Back at the precinct, the detective pored over the seized documents. The front company's shell corporation names were exposed, bank accounts frozen. Federal agents boarded a flight to Switzerland to trace laundered funds. This case, the officer's case, would become a blueprint for dismantling animal trafficking networks worldwide. Later, alone in his living room, he settled beside Daisy on the couch. She rested her head on his lap, eyes heavy but bright. He sipped coffee and flipped through the volunteer's log one last time, tracing each entry that had led them here. His gaze settled on the moment he first saw her tag, Buddy. A small smile curved his lips. Fate had spun a cruel twist, but it had also led him to justice. He reached out and scratched behind her ear. "We did more than save you," he whispered. "We saved them all." Daisy lifted her head, pressing her muzzle into his hand in acknowledgement. Outside, the world moved on. Birds sang, cars rumbled down distant streets, and the press prepared to share the story of a cop who chased hope through darkness and emerged victorious. He rose and opened the front door to the morning light. Daisy followed, paws catching on the threshold. He closed his eyes and inhaled. This was more than a reunion. It was a promise fulfilled. The bond between man and dog had conquered fear, cruelty, and the shadowy depths of human greed. And as long as there were those who needed saving, he'd answer the call. He turned to Daisy and offered a gentle command. "Let's go home." She bounded forward, tail high, toward a future built on trust and love. He watched her go, heart full. Their journey had ended, but their story, and the stories of countless others, would live on. If you believe every life deserves a chance, hit subscribe.